I think that all students should be engaged in this conversation, particularly high school students who are really going into colleges and universities, and some are going into the workforce, and they need to be prepared. Need to be prepared to work with diverse colleagues, need to be prepared to be confronted with diverse perspectives and viewpoints, and certainly exposed to some opportunities to engage in critical conversations. So this is a great question. I'm excited to answer it. And here's my thinking on how these conversations happen, because I think sometimes people shy away from these conversations because when we talk about diversity, diversity is very broad. We're talking about age, we're talking about gender, sexuality, race, religion, national origin, political perspectives, ability levels. It's so broad. And so I think that sometimes diversity is coded, and really people want to talk about race, but they say that they want to talk about diversity. So I think the important thing when you're having conversations about diversity as well as racial equality and equity is to name what you want to talk about. Just first of all, say, I want to have a broad conversation about diversity and how it impacts the lives of high school students or young adults. And then you get to have a richer discussion about all the ways in which we're diverse. But if you want to have a conversation about race, then you need to name that I want to have a conversation about race, and this is why. So conversations about race are very difficult. It's very difficult because of the legacy of race in our country, because of the fact that enslaved Africans were brought to this country, and then they continue to be oppressed after they were no longer slaves. And so we see the legacy of that live out today. We see race relations in a very, very problematic place right now. And it's because of our inability to talk about it in a meaningful way. So I think we start with, if we want to talk about race, we talk about the fact that we have to listen more. That means if you are not directly impacted by race, you're not a target of racism, then that means you need to listen more, because you don't know what it's like. We talk about perspective taking and walking in someone else's shoes. Well, that's exactly what you have to do in a conversation about race, because if you're not a person that comes from a racially and ethnically diverse background, it's very hard for you to make sense of the everyday nuances of race and how it plays out in the lives of those people that are. So one, I say listen more. Two, I say be empathetic on both sides. So if you are a person from a racially diverse background and you are sharing your story, then others need to be empathetic. But we also, as we're sharing our stories, need to understand that people come at this discussion from different places, from different levels of understanding. So there are going to be lots of questions asked. And you might think, oh, this is such a basic elementary question they're asking, but you have to be empathetic, and you have to understand that not everybody has the same background and experience. And so you want to use this as an opportunity to educate. I think that's the most important thing I would say as an educator myself. I started as a high school teacher. And so for me, I think that I'm always educating people. So when people ask questions, if people raise concerns, if people think that they don't want to talk because it's not politically correct, they're afraid they'll say the wrong thing, then my goal is to educate. If I can introduce people to some readings, whether those be articles, whether those be books that help them to expand their understanding of these issues, I'm happy to do that. If I can answer questions about my own lived experiences, I am happy to do that as well. So I think being empathetic, asking questions. I also think that it's always great to have a book study, because Books center conversations and it takes it away from the individuals that are involved in the study. So then it becomes about what the author said versus what Monika said. And Monika is a Black woman, so this is Monika's personal agenda that she's pushing. So I think that when we use book studies, it helps to foster dialogue and it helps to take the personal out of the discussion. Now, of course, people then bring in their own experiences, but I think a great facilitator brings folks back to what is the text trying to tell, what's the author trying to tell us, what is the text helping us to understand about this topic. And then finally, I would say in terms of these discussions, particularly for young adults, I think that it's helpful to diversify your media consumption. And I know that's kind of hard to do because I know YouTube, Snapchat, whatever else is out there. I know no one uses Instagram anymore or Facebook, but I think sometimes we only hear messages that are comfortable, that are reaffirming to us. And I think that is problematic when you're talking about issues of diversity, issues of race, because I think that if you look at your media consumption, if you have people that are all saying the same thing, then that's problematic because you don't get those diverse viewpoints that I mentioned earlier, that you don't get to hear from other sides, you don't get exposed to other ways of thinking. And so I really encourage students as well as educators to facilitate these conversations by introducing diverse viewpoints. One of the things that we face on a college campus is that we get reports of students saying negative things on social media, derogatory terms, whether it be racist, homophobic, whether it be anti-Semitic. We get students that post things on social media, and I think students forget that it's out there forever. It's hard to bring that back in. But we have students that are impacted by those messages, those images, and they say, we want them kicked out of school, we want them expelled. And the message that we send is that we embrace freedom of speech. Even if we don't like the speech, we embrace it, because even if your message is positive and you want to get that message out, you don't want anybody saying, no, we don't want to hear that positive message. You don't want anybody shutting down that speech. So we can't shut down the speech that we don't like either. Even though it's hateful, divisive, you can't shut it down. But what you can do is look at the impact that those messages have on different audiences. So if it's anti-Semitic, then listen to the impact that it has on a Jewish person and think about how you would feel if you were in that situation and someone chose your identity. And we all have multiple identities. If they picked on one of your multiple identities and then they spoke to it in a derogatory manner, how would you feel? How would you respond? And so I think thinking twice about what we put out in social media and certainly what you take in terms of consumption is very important to keep it balanced. And I know that's hard, but we got to try to do that. I think developing authentic relationships is so important. I think also oftentimes when we're talking about race, someone will say, I'm not racist, I have a Black friend, or I have somebody Black in my family, or I have a Latino that I've been raised with. That's not racism. Racism is much broader than individual local issues or interactions. Racism is structural, it's systemic. We can see, if you can see it outside of the individual interactions, that's what we're talking about. So I think having relationships is important. And what I say is that I think people need to decide if they're going to be allies, if they're going to be advocates, or accomplices. If you're not one of those three, then you are a part of the problem. So how do you become an ally? Then you have to go into spaces where these issues are being discussed. If that's through your local clubs and your school clubs or after school clubs, if that means that you are engaged in a circle of even your friends that may look just like you. Why can't you start a group of white girls or white boys who are taking on this issue of racism and saying, I want to be an ally. I want to change the perception that white men are automatically racist. I want to change that, but you can't change that unless you take that step to be anti-racist. So you can't just sit back and wait for it to change. You have to be a part of that. So I would say try to find ways to develop these authentic relationships. They can't be forced. Be prepared to do a lot of listening. Be prepared to certainly ask questions if you don't understand. And then do some reading. Don't put the burden on educating yourself on someone that comes from a different race or ethnicity. That's not their job to educate you. It's your job to educate you. So I think as you are developing these relationships, you need to be reading more, you need to be learning more. And I think also if there's not a space in your school that allows for you all to address these issues, then create one. If there's not a diversity club or not a social justice club or a unity club, then create one. Start with the people who are like-minded and others will join in. I think if you, and I think the last thing I'll say on that is don't expect a pat on the back or there you go, thank you so much. Don't expect anything. Don't do it for that because you may not get it. People may look at you and say, oh, I'm weary of this. I don't know what this is about. And they might have a wait and see attitude, and that's okay. But if you're committed, don't do it because you think you're going to get kudos or thanks. Do it because you believe it's the right thing to do. Lead with the fact that we are all human. And that is basic. Without, if you don't look at someone's race, ethnicity, yes, that's a part of who they are. I certainly don't want people to be colorblind saying I don't see color because that's problematic as well. But I want people to say that I want to treat people the way I want to be treated. If you start with that premise, then I think you're on the right track. The second thing I would say is in terms of leadership, you need to be in allyship with the people that you want to support. So it shouldn't be if just you leading. You need to make sure that the voices of those people that are impacted are at the table as well. They might not want to lead, but you need them at the table so that, as you shared, you can learn from them in terms of their experiences, and then you don't go into a situation where you're making assumptions or you are guessing about what we should be doing as a school. You want to involve other voices in that. And then I end with, dignity and respect go a long way. And I know that there's some, people find it entertaining to not be dignified and not be respectful. But I think that has nothing to do with being politically correct. It has to do with being a productive citizen. And in a democracy, it's important to treat individuals with dignity and respect. If you start there, then you'll be a great leader and people will follow.